I would like to go over absolute positioning. On the left, we have some code. On the right, we have the output of the code. In the body section, we have two divs. The outer div, or parent, has relative position, noted by the class equals relative. The inner div, or child, has absolute position, noted by class equals absolute. So if we look at the CSS, we can see that we have the position property set to relative for the outer div, the position property set to absolute for the inner div. Notice that there are no other properties set with respect to the positioning location. On the right, you see the outer div, which is the green box, and the inner div, which is the red box. Notice by default, the absolutely positioned element is in the top left corner of the parent, provided the parent has position relative. This is the most common combination for using absolute positioning. You have a relatively positioned parent or ancestor and an absolutely positioned child. That way you can move the child anywhere you want inside of its parent. Should I add a top and left value to the absolute div, I can move it around inside the relative div. Should I remove position relative from the green div, now our absolutely positioned element is positioned with respect to the body. This can yield unwanted effects, so please always use absolute positioning inside a relatively positioned parent. A very common use of absolute positioning is with drop-down navigation. And here we see drop-down navigation. By default, one HTML element can exist on the page at a time. If you notice that our navigation is overlapping the rest of the page. That is what absolute and fixed positioning does. They take the content with either absolute or fixed positioning and lay it on top of the page. Therefore, it loses its relationship to the page, and you may need to resize the width depending on the individual situation. Not necessarily in this case. Let's take a look at the HTML. Here we have nav ID equals nav top. We have one main UL, which is typical for our navigation. However, we have a nested UL inside two of the LI tags. The nested UL is actually the drop-down menu. Notice when I hover over that LI element, the menu appears directly underneath it. Therefore, we don't need to set a left or a top. It will just fit there where it is. So here we have a UL, which is a child, and an LI, which is a parent. Now let's look at the CSS. We have ID equals navtop, where we set our position relative. Now we have a descendant selector, navtop LIUL. This reads the UL that is a descendant of LI, that is a descendant of pound navtop. So back to the HTML, here is the UL, which is a descendant of the LI, which is a descendant of navtop. There are only two ULs here that have an LI parent. So we set the position to absolute and the display to none. When the page loads, we do not see that. Now, when the cursor hovers over the LI, that is the parent of the UL, we change the display to block and we see that menu. You can also read this as the UL that is a descendant of an LI with a hover that is a descendant of ID equals navtop. This is very different than just UL being a descendant of LI. It's a descendant of LI with a hover, a pseudo class, and we are using that pseudo class in part of the descendant selector to set the style only for that occurrence. So absolute positioning and CSS pseudo classes enable us to create our drop-down navigation.